Hey friends, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder to like and subscribe and to leave a comment saying where you're watching from or what you're doing right now. Now, with that said, let's get down to business because we've got a ton of history content to cover. If you'd stepped into a refined English drawing room in 1800, you'd likely have encountered a sight that seemed to defy the very laws of biological physics. Hanging prominently within a heavy, gilded frame, a creature that was supposedly a pig or sheep or a cow didn't look like a living animal at all, but rather like a breathing brick of meat. Its body was rendered as a perfect rectangle, a sharp-edged block of muscle and fat so massive that the four spindly legs supporting it looked as if they might snap at any moment. These oat-stuffed animals weren't the result of an artistic blunder or a painter who'd never visited a farm. Instead, they were carefully constructed status symbols, the visual manifestos of an agricultural revolution that was reshaping the British landscape. This era of rectangular livestock painting was a profound display of power, wealth, and a radical new way of conceptualizing the natural world as something to be engineered for profit. Also, if you're one of those people who tends to just listen to my videos, there's a lot of interesting art from the time period here that you're going to want to see. The late 18th and early 19th centuries were a period of frantic change for Britain. As the Industrial Revolution shifted into high gear, the population of urban centers exploded, and all those factory workers needed a reliable source of food. This created a massive, lucrative market for meat, milk, and tallow. In response, a new class of landowner emerged, known as the improvers. These weren't traditional farmers who were content with the methods of their ancestors. They were scientific tinkerers who viewed livestock as biological machines that could be refined for maximum output. They believed that through rigorous intervention and selective breeding, they could create animals that grew faster and fatter than anything nature had originally intended. To these men, a perfectly square cow was tangible proof that they'd mastered the science of breeding and had successfully bent the biological world to their will. This obsession with size was framed as much more than just a way to generate wealth. It was presented to the public as a profound patriotic duty. With the nation frequently engaged in costly conflicts and the domestic population rising, food security was a major political concern. Elite farmers argued that by developing these gargantuan meat mountains, they were providing a vital service to the entire country. They claimed that their experiments in creating massive cattle would eventually trickle down to smaller, more modest farmers. This in turn would lead to a more productive agricultural system that would benefit everyone from the monarchy to the common laborer. Some animals were even given names like Patriot to emphasize this connection between a farmer's breeding success and his devotion to the British crown. When an artist captured a cow as a perfect rectangle, they were painting a portrait of a national hero, a fleshy pillar of British prosperity and industrial progress. There was a very cold, calculated economic reason for the preference for such extreme fatness. In a world before electric lights and modern synthetic lubricants, animal fat, specifically tallow, was a critical industrial resource. It was used to produce the candles that lit every home and provided the essential grease for the heavy machinery that powered the nation's factories. It's estimated that the fat from a single prize-winning animal could sometimes be worth significantly more than the meat itself. Breeders were incentivized to produce animals that could pack on as much fat as possible, and the rectangular shape was considered the most efficient container for that weight. A square silhouette signaled that the animal was carrying the maximum amount of high-value tallow along its back and sides. The geometry was a visual code for the financial value of truly industrial livestock. The most famous figure in this era of agricultural spectacle was undoubtedly the Durham ox. Born in 1796 and bred by the Calling brothers, this bull became a genuine national celebrity. Eventually purchased by a traveling showman named John Day, the ox was taken on an epic tour across England and Scotland that lasted for 5 years. Day even had a custom-made carriage built to move the massive animal, which was reported to weigh nearly 3,000 pounds. Everywhere they went, crowds of people paid for the privilege of seeing this monstrous creature in person. The ox's image was reproduced in thousands of prints and engravings, which were sold as souvenirs. These images were so popular that they were even used as patterns for dinner plates. This in turn allowed families to literally eat their meals off the likeness of the greatest representative of the world's most famous beef producer. Not to be outdone, the Craven heifer became another legendary figure in the early 1800s. Born in 1807 on a grand estate in Yorkshire, she was fed relentlessly until she reached record-breaking proportions. She remains the largest cow ever shown in England, weighing over 4,000 pounds. Like the Durham ox, she was taken on tour, a journey that was so slow and difficult, it took 73 days just to travel from Wakefield to London. She was so wide that her owners had to build a special doorway for her cowshed that was twice the normal size just so she could get in and out. These celebrity animals were subjected to a strange life of extreme pampering, mixed with the grueling physical strain of constant travel and public exhibition. The artists who created these iconic paintings were often provincial or itinerant specialists who moved from one grand estate to another. These artists who were commissioned to put these meat castles to canvas weren't looking for the approval of high-minded art critics in London or Paris. They were working for practical-minded landowners who wanted an accurate, if idealized, record of their achievements. These painters were effectively creating trophies that their owners could hang on their walls to announce their success to any visitor. The influence of these images wasn't confined to the walls of manor houses. Thanks to new printing technologies, the images of celebrity animals entered the homes of the growing middle class. Pottery manufacturers began producing vast quantities of dinnerware featuring these livestock portraits. Owning a platter with the image of a famous meat rectangle was a way for a family to show that they were modern, patriotic, and aligned with the ideals of progress. The dining table became a place where status was displayed not just by the food being served, but by the very dishes it was served on. This mass distribution helped to cement the rectangular aesthetic as a defining visual symbol of the era, making the square cow a recognizable icon across the entire country. But unfortunately, there's a very dark side to this pursuit of geometric perfection that was often overlooked in the celebratory atmosphere of the time. The extreme selective breeding and intensive feeding required to create these massive animals took a devastating toll on their health. These so-called improved creatures were often so heavy that they could barely move, their delicate legs struggling under the weight of bodies that had been engineered for sheer volume. The short lifespans of animals like the Durham ox and the Craven heifer were a direct result of the physiological strain their bodies were put under. For the breeders, these were the necessary sacrifices in the name of progress and national food security. The paintings capture a moment of triumph for biological engineering, but they also record a period of profound suffering that was justified by the economic needs of the time. As the 19th century wore on, the fashion for rectangular livestock began to fade. The science of agriculture became more refined, and breeders started to prioritize traits like efficiency and meat quality over sheer visible bulk. At the same time, the art world moved toward a more naturalistic style, and the portraits of itinerant painters were replaced by more realistic depictions of rural life. The silence of a Russian winter at the turn of the 20th century wasn't just a matter of quiet nights. In certain pockets of the Pskov region, It was a silence that reportedly swallowed entire families for months at a time. Picture a timber hut, its windows sealed with thick ice and its door banked with drifting snow, where the only sign of life is a faint rhythmic breathing from atop a massive stone stove. There's no smoke from the chimney, no light in the windows, and no tracks in the yard. This isn't a tragic scene, though, far from it. According to reports that captivated the medical world in 1900, it was a calculated strategy for survival. For nearly half the year, these peasants allegedly entered a state of semi-dormancy, a human echo of the deep sleep found in the animal kingdom. The primary evidence for this extraordinary behavior comes from a report published in the British Medical Journal in 1900. This report claimed to detail a practice allegedly common in the Peskov government of northwestern Russia. The claim suggested that the local peasantry, faced with a chronic state of famine and an annual scarcity of resources, had developed a method called Lotska. This was, the report claimed, a common Russian word that would be recognized in many of the most frigid regions of this vast continent-spanning empire. When the first snow fell in November, entire families would gather around their large masonry stoves, lie down, and effectively withdraw from the world until the spring thaw in April. The account noted that because the agricultural yield wasn't sufficient to sustain active life throughout the winter, they chose to enter a deep metabolic sleep. In the original report, this was framed as a widespread cultural practice, and not a response to a specific famine or mass starvation event. They didn't sleep for months on end without waking, but rather, they existed in a state of extreme lethargy, which would put a sloth to shame. Once a day, the family members would rouse themselves just enough to consume a single piece of hard bread, dipped in water. They took turns staying awake for brief periods to ensure the fire in the stove didn't go out, as the warmth was their only shield against the Arctic air. When examining the historical truth behind Lotska, researchers are immediately met with a significant linguistic hurdle: the word itself. Modern Russian speakers have pointed out that Lotska isn't a recognized term in the Russian language. This has led some to suspect the original 1900 report was a hoax or a result of deep cross-cultural confusion. However, a closer look at regional dialects suggests the word might have been a transcription error for lezhka, which translates to the process of lying down. This term would accurately describe the act of hunkering down for the winter. The fact that Western journals like the New York Times and the British Medical Journal reportedly carried the story independently suggests there was some underlying administrative source. There was likely an official report from the Russian Bureau of Statistics in the Department of Peskov detailing a similar phenomenon. Unfortunately, as is generally the case in Russian history, things would get worse, and records would be lost or destroyed. The credibility of the Lotska claim is tied to the dire economic reality of the Russian Empire in the late 19th century. Region-specific studies show that areas like Peskov suffered from chronic famine, where crop failures weren't occasional tragedies, but an annual expectation. The 1891 to 1892 famine was particularly devastating, resulting in an estimated 500,000 deaths and exposing the extreme fragility of the peasant economy. In such an environment, reducing physical activity to almost zero wasn't a choice so much as a necessity. Since these communities primarily generated resources through farming, there was little incentive to work during the frozen months when the soil was impenetrable. According to this theory, as soon as the outside world was warm enough to permit agricultural tasks, the peasants would wake up and return to their regular labor. The central technological component of this winter sleep was the Russian stove, or pech. This massive masonry structure wasn't just for cooking. It was the thermal heart of the home, designed to retain heat for extended periods. The top of the stove was a flat, warm area used specifically for sleeping. Traditional Russian huts featured raised wooden platforms extending from the stove to the walls. These platforms allowed entire families to sleep together in the warmest part of the house, using their collective body heat and the stove's thermal mass to survive the cold. While this proves that it was theoretically possible to largely sleep all winter with little time awake, the biological reality suggests something quite different. From a medical perspective, the idea of 6 months of bed rest is fraught with danger. Modern studies on the effects of immobilization show that humans quickly suffer from muscle atrophy, bone density loss, and cardiovascular deconditioning. Without physical activity, the heart's ability to maintain blood pressure decreases, often leading to fainting when a person eventually tries to stand. Furthermore, humans don't possess the biological machinery for anything approaching true hibernation. True hibernators, such as bears or marmots, can lower their body temperature and metabolic rate by significant margins, often surviving on internal fat stores for months. The Latska practice, if it existed, was likely not a state of hibernation, but of extreme starvation-induced lethargy. If the peasants were indeed surviving on just a single piece of bread daily along with some water, they would have been in a state of severe malnutrition. Despite what the original article claimed, it appears that this wasn't a cultural tradition or anything approaching hibernation. Rather, it may have been a localized response by these peasants, using the equipment they had that allowed them to increase their chances of survival during a famine. Russia wasn't the only place where these claims surfaced, and there's unsubstantiated claims that peasants in the Alps and the Pyrenees employed similar strategies. Similar stories also exist in Inuit culture, especially in Greenland, where people supposedly slept through the entire winter. However, it remains unclear whether these claims are embellished or symbolic oral traditions, or based on actual historical events. In the end, the historical Latska may be more myth than science, but the concept continues to fascinate the public and historians alike. In general, the consensus for the time being is that what the British medical report was describing was a mechanism to combat mass starvation. It may have been something that was employed during the absolute worst winters of a famine, but it was by no means the routine practice that some claim it to be today. In the mid-19th century, scientists faced a riddle that defied easy explanation. They had found fossils of lemurs, small monkey-like primates, in India. Living lemurs, however, were solely concentrated on the island of Madagascar, thousands of miles away. The strangest part was that there was no trace of them, living or fossilized, in the vast intervening lands of mainland Africa or the Middle East. In a world that didn't yet understand plate tectonics, this biogeographical puzzle left scientists baffled. In 1864, a respected British zoologist named Philip Lutley Scalater offered a solution. In a paper titled The Mammals of Madagascar, he proposed that a vast continent must have once existed in the Indian Ocean, connecting India and Madagascar. This massive land bridge would have allowed the lemurs to migrate freely. After it served its evolutionary purpose, he theorized, this landmass sank beneath the waves. He gave this hypothetical continent a fitting name, Lemuria. It was a simple, logical, and elegant scientific hypothesis. It was also completely wrong. But the idea Scalater unleashed was far too powerful to be undone by mere facts. His thought had just been born, and it was about to begin one of the strangest journeys in the history of ideas. And trust me, this hypothesis about lemurs would go to some very crazy and very non-lemur related places really quickly. It's important to understand that Scalater's idea wasn't fringe for its time. It was actually considered quite brilliant and progressive. In the Victorian era, proposing sunken continents and land bridges was a perfectly respectable scientific tool. Without an understanding of continental drift, geologists and biologists use these geographies to explain all sorts of anomalies in rock formations and species distribution across the globe. Scalator, a serious and prolific zoologist, was just engaging in standard scientific practice. But his idea was quickly adopted and radically transformed by another more famous scientist. Ernst Haeckel, a prominent German biologist, was a fierce advocate for Darwin's new theory of evolution. Haeckel was obsessed with finding the missing link, the fossil evidence of a proto-human that would bridge the gap between apes and modern Homo sapiens. The embarrassing lack of such fossils was a major vulnerability for the theory. Haeckel seized upon Scalator's Lemuria as the perfect solution. In his 1876 book, The History of Creation, he proposed that Lemuria was not just a bridge for lemurs, but the very cradle of humanity. Also, I miss the days when scientists and historians could unironically name their works, The History of Creation, and just run with it. But I digress. His reasoning was simple. If humanity evolved on a continent that was now at the bottom of the Indian Ocean, it would perfectly explain why we couldn't find any fossils. In his maps, Haeckel confidently labeled this sunken landmass Eden and showed the various human races migrating from this single origin point to populate the rest of the globe. With Haeckel's influential backing, Lemuria made its first great pivot. It was no longer a niche zoological hypothesis, but a grand theory of human origins. Haeckel's scientific stamp of approval made Lemuria irresistible to a group that had no interest in lemurs, but a profound interest in lost cradles of humanity. This is where the myth truly took flight, thanks to one of the 19th century's most enigmatic and influential figures, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. Blavatsky was the co-founder of the Theosophical Society, a mystical religious movement that blended Eastern philosophy with Western esotericism. In her 1888 magnum opus, The Secret Doctrine, she unveiled a complex and sweeping history of the cosmos and humanity's evolution. But Blavatsky's Lemurians were nothing like Scalator's primates or Haeckel's missing links. They were giants, described as standing 12 to 15 feet tall. They were androgynous or hermaphroditic, laid eggs, and possessed a third eye in the back of their heads, which gave them psychic abilities. This was the myth's most important transformation. Blavatsky and the Theosophists had successfully severed Lemuria from any testable scientific claim. Its history was no longer accessible through geology or fossil hunting, but only through clairvoyant readings of the Akashic records. The hypothesis had become an article of faith, making it completely immune to any future scientific debunking. But back to Scalator's original puzzle. Science did eventually find the answer, and it was just as fantastic as Lemuria, but true. The theory of continental drift, or plate tectonics, which was proposed in 1912 and finally accepted in the 1960s, rendered the Lemuria hypothesis obsolete. Notably, when German geophysicist Alfred Wegener proposed this theory, his ideas were considered completely non-scientific. Interestingly, the new theory confirmed that Scalator's observation was correct. Madagascar and India had been connected. But they weren't a continent that sank. They were part of the ancient supercontinent Gondwanaland. They didn't sink. They drifted apart. The fatal flaw in Scalator's theory was the timeline. The breakup that separated India from Madagascar occurred roughly 80 to 90 million years ago. This was millions of years before the first lemurs or any other primates had even evolved. They couldn't have walked across a land bridge. The real solution to the riddle of the lemurs is believed to be oceanic dispersal. Scientists theorize that millions of years ago, a small group of ancestral lemurs was swept out to sea from mainland Africa, perhaps on a large mat of vegetation during a storm. By a 1 in a billion chance, they survived the 560-kilometer journey and landed on the isolated island of Madagascar, where, free from competition, they evolved. By the time science provided this definitive, evidence-based answer, it didn't matter. The myth of Lemuria had long since escaped the laboratory. The air inside Pete Maxwell's ranch house was thick and still, just after midnight on July 14th, 1881. Outside, in the oppressive New Mexico heat, Lincoln County Sheriff Pat Garrett and his two deputies, John Poe and Thomas McKinney, waited in the shadows. Garrett slipped inside, leaving his men on the porch, and moved through the darkness to Maxwell's bedroom. As he began to question Maxwell about the whereabouts of a certain high-profile fugitive, a figure appeared in the doorway. Barefoot and carrying a butcher knife, the man hadn't come to attack. He just wanted a slice of that sweet late-night beef. He spotted the deputies outside, pulled out his revolver, and recoiled into the dark room, calling out for the men to identify themselves. Then things went eerily quiet for a moment, before two blasts rang out in the dark. There was a brief strangling gasp and then nothing. This was the moment the law and history recorded the death of one of the Old West's most famous outlaws, a man known as Billy the Kid. Yet, for a story that appeared to have been ended with such finality, it refused to stay buried. The very circumstances that Garrett would describe as a stroke of luck were the same ones that made his story vulnerable to doubt. His deputies, waiting outside, were documented to have been initially skeptical that the dead man was the famous outlaw. This ambiguity, born in the same instant as the kid's official death, provided the fertile ground for one of the Old West's most persistent legends. To this day, many question whether Billy the Kid escaped and survived, living on into old age despite all the odds. Before he was a legend, Billy the Kid was Henry McCarty, born in a New York slum to Irish immigrants around 1859. And if you're wondering how he came to be known as Billy, well, by the 1870s, he was going by the alias William Bonney. His early life was a westward drift with his mother Catherine that ended in Silver City, New Mexico. When she died of tuberculosis, as was the style at the time, the orphaned teenager was cast adrift, working odd jobs before his first arrest for stealing cheese. Physically, he wasn't much to look at, but he possessed a disarming charisma. He loved to sing, dance, drink, and gamble to excess, and was described as being the life of the party. He was also fluent in Spanish, which made him fit in much easier with the population of New Mexico. And keep this in mind, because his ability to rizz up local Latinas in Espanol will be a factor when we discuss the claimants to his identity. This charm, however, was paired with a quick and lethal temper. His transformation into a wanted outlaw was forged in the crucible of the Lincoln County feud. This brutal conflict began as a more traditional fight between an established merchant faction, the Murphy-Dolan Company, and a newcomer, John Tunstall. The Kid worked for Tunstall, and when his employer was slain by a posse allied with the Murphy-Dolan faction, he didn't pack it up and go home. He joined a deputized posse called the Regulators to hunt down those who had slain Tunstall, believing he was an agent of justice in a territory where the law was corrupt. The whole thing degenerated into a tit-for-tat slaughter, and eventually the Kid cut down a lawman, making him a wanted man. Later, Old West legends would claim he was one of the deadliest outlaws, having taken 21 lives in his 21 years on Earth, though this is now believed to be an exercise in myth-building. That said, don't get mistaken and think Billy the Kid wasn't a dangerous man. Despite only making it to our modern drinking age, he was directly involved in the elimination of at least 9 men, and that's just what's been documented and confirmed. After being captured by Pat Garrett and sentenced to hang, the Kid cemented his legendary status with a daring escape from the Lincoln County Courthouse. In the process of the escape, he eliminated 2 lawmen, including shooting one of them in the back as he tried to escape. This jailbreak made him a folk hero to some, while others viewed him as a cold-blooded monster who had to be eliminated immediately. Decades after the shots in Maxwell's bedroom, men emerged claiming the story was a lie. The 2 most famous claimants offered compelling, if deeply flawed, narratives that have captivated believers ever since. In 1948, an elderly man in Hyco, Texas, named Brushy Bill Roberts, confessed to a paralegal named William Morrison that he was the real Billy the Kid. Roberts, then allegedly around 90 years old, claimed he was tired of hiding and wanted Morrison's help to secure a pardon for his actions. His evidence was based on personal testimony. He allegedly showed Morrison 26 scars from bullet and knife wounds that matched injuries the Kid had supposedly sustained. He also possessed an intimate knowledge of the Lincoln County conflict, and Morrison managed to secure sworn affidavits from a few surviving acquaintances of the Kid. According to Roberts, Garrett's posse had mistakenly ended the life of an innocent man named Billy Barlow on the night in question. In this version of events, Billy the Kid took this opportunity to escape and assume a new identity, eventually transforming into Brushy Bill the Prospector. However, the case for Brushy Bill quickly falls apart under scrutiny. Most historians dismiss the claim, pointing to a family Bible that records his birth year as 1879, which would have made him a toddler when the Kid died. Further, despite Brushy Bill claiming to have 26 battle scars, Billy the Kid was only shot once, and was never recorded to have been stabbed. Billy was definitely more of a giver than a taker when it came to combat wounds, but Brushy Bill didn't seem to get the memo on that part. Notably, Billy the Kid was literate, while Brushy Bill was not. Further, Billy the Kid spoke Spanish at a native level fluency, and he is well documented as having used this linguistic proficiency to win over the local ladies and chill with bad hombres. Further, Roberts had previously claimed to be a member of the Jesse James gang, suggesting a pattern of adopting notorious identities. Some modern analyses even propose his case was an extreme form of celebrity worship, where his own identity had merged with that of the famous outlaw he admired. In essence, he was so obsessed with these Wild West figures that he may have developed a real, though completely delusional belief that he was one of them. Notably, the corpses of the man who Pat Garrett said was Billy the Kid and Brushy Bill are still available for testing, though the authorities have blocked exhumation efforts. The claim of John Miller is more mysterious and is built on a foundation of circumstantial evidence and secondhand stories. Miller, a farmer who died in Arizona in 1937, never made a public claim, but friends and family insisted he was the Kid. According to them, he wouldn't admit it when sober, but when he got absolutely blotto, he would sing like a canary. Crucially, there are almost no official records of a John Miller existing before August 1881, less than a month after the Kid's supposed death. Unlike Brushy Bill, John Miller was actually fluent in Spanish and was also literate. After his passing, his Mexican-American wife confirmed his ability to speak Spanish at a native level and also attested to his ability to slip out of handcuffs. Billy the Kid had famously slipped out of cuffs on a couple of occasions. And yeah, I'm just going to leave that last bit right there and not make the obvious joke about what this couple might have been getting up to in their private lives. While the stories of Roberts and Miller are interesting and have a lot of popular support, the historical consensus supports the official account of the kid's death. This conclusion rests not on folklore, but on the weight of contemporary evidence. The single most powerful document is the coroner's jury report, filed the day after the shooting. A jury of local men, many of whom knew the kid personally, examined the body and identified it as William Bonney. This legal document, created at the time of the event, is the bedrock of the historical record. While this would be definitive if we were talking about a document issued today, it's a bit less definitive than you might think. This was, after all, the Wild West, and Pat Garrett and his posse had $500 riding on this jury, determining the body was that of Billy. In a time and place where the line between lawman and outlaw could change back and forth with stunning rapidity, the jury may have been pressured to just go along with the identification. Beyond the inquest, an official paper trail confirms the government acted on the certainty of the kid's death. Records show the New Mexico Attorney General and the governor approved the $500 reward payment to Pat Garrett on the basis of the coroner's jury report. According to those who believe the official narrative, these bureaucratic actions would not have occurred if there were any credible doubt about the identity of the deceased. Garrett also made a crucial strategic move by putting the body on public display in Fort Sumner. In an era without modern forensics, visual identification by the community was the highest standard of proof. That said, decomposition in the heat is a very real problem, and to what extent the body actually resembled Billy the Kid at the time of this event is unknown. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy, just taking a moment to shout out all my subscribers, YouTube members, and patrons. Also, don't forget to check out the video podcast by clicking the link in the description. I also have two other channels, Lazy Chill Zone and Lazy Chill True Crime, which you can find by searching them up. On July 14, 1882, a man named James Yost was hauling wood through the dry grasslands of West Turkey Creek Canyon in Arizona Territory when his dog started acting strangely. Nearing a peculiar cluster of 5 large oak trees that grew in a semicircle from a single root, Yost saw what he first took to be a man sleeping. But the dog's nervous snorting told a different story, and upon investigation, Yost found the lifeless body of one of the West's most notorious outlaws, Johnny Ringo. He was seated on a large, flat rock within the embrace of the oaks, his back against a tree in an almost peaceful pose. But the scene was anything but peaceful. A single bullet had entered his right temple and exited the top of his head. His weapon was still in his hand, and it looked very clear what happened. But as time went on, this clear-cut scene became one of the Old West's greatest mysteries. Ringo was barefoot, his feet wrapped in makeshift bindings torn from his own undershirt. His horse, with his boots still tied to the saddle, wouldn't be found for another 11 days, 2 miles away. He wore 2 cartridge belts, but the one for his revolver was buckled upside down, an inexplicable mistake for a seasoned veteran of the Old West. Most disturbing of all was a small, clean cut at the base of his scalp, as if someone had taken a piece of his head to prove that the deed was done. To understand how Johnny Ringo ended up under those oaks, you have to understand the man he was. Born in Indiana in 1850, his life was defined by a profound, early trauma. At the age of 14, while his family migrated west, he witnessed his father accidentally take a shotgun blast directly to the face. The family was forced to bury him on a hillside along the trail and move on, with little time to contemplate whether this was really an accident or not. This gruesome event created a dark psychological echo that would reverberate throughout Ringo's own life. In the years that followed, Ringo cultivated the persona of a refined, educated gentleman outlaw, a man who could quote Shakespeare and carried a small library of classic books. Many who knew him described him as a reserved, college-educated man, though the truth was more complex. While well-read, Ringo had very little in the way of formal schooling. This intellectual image was a performance, a charming mask for a disturbed and violent man who wanted to be known for something other than his willingness to blast his Roscoe. His outlaw career began in earnest in Texas, where he got his start committing some cold-blooded slayings. After the heat got too hot under the Texas sun, he decided it was best to move on. After drifting to Arizona, he fell in with the loose confederation of rustlers known as the Cochise County Cowboys. In Tombstone, his reputation for a foul temper was cemented by incidents like shooting a man simply for refusing a shot of whiskey in favor of beer. Ringo was not present for the famous showdown at the OK Corral, but in its aftermath, he became a chief antagonist of the Earp faction. He openly challenged Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday to a fight on the streets of Tombstone, a confrontation that was only stopped when a constable intervened. The Earps, in turn, suspected Ringo was involved in the ambush that crippled Virgil Earp and the slaying of Morgan Earp. When Wyatt Earp began his infamous vendetta ride, Ringo, despite being an absolute psychopath, was deputized by the sheriff of Tombstone to hunt him down. Faced with the scene in Turkey Creek Canyon, a coroner's jury quickly reached a verdict. They looked at the scene and figured that this was the work of one man, Johnny Ringo himself. This ruling was supported by a considerable amount of anecdotal evidence. The story about the so-called accident his dad had during the family's westward travels was well known, and suggested a potential family history of this sort of event. In the months before his death, Ringo was reportedly in a deep state of despair. The Earp vendetta had decimated the ranks of his friends and allies. Further, he had recently visited his family in California and had been met with a cool reception and politely told he wasn't welcome to stay there, leaving him feeling rejected. The freewheeling, lawless world he knew was vanishing, and he seemed to be vanishing with it. His final days were spent in a prolonged drunken stupor. He left Tombstone after the 4th of July celebrations with several bottles of booze and was last seen by a sheriff's deputy who noted that he was falling off his horse. More telling were Ringo's own premonitions. He had told a newspaper editor just weeks earlier that he only had a few weeks left at best, and he implied that this event could be caused by either himself or by his enemies. Despite the official ruling, the strange clues at the scene have fueled speculation of a slaying for over a century. Several suspects have been named, their motives rooted in the legendary feuds of Tombstone, Arizona. The most famous and cinematic theory is that Wyatt Earp, perhaps accompanied by Doc Holliday, secretly rode back into Arizona to fill Ringo full of lead and complete his vendetta. Earp himself helped craft this narrative in his later years, even providing his biographer with a detailed account of a supposed duel. This story provides a satisfying, dramatic conclusion to the Earp Cowboy War, pitting the two factions' champions against each other in a final showdown. However, this theory completely falls apart under factual scrutiny since Ringo died in July 1882. Earp and his posse had fled Arizona as wanted men 4 months earlier, in March. Doc Holliday, the other supposed participant, attended court in Colorado the same day as Ringo perished. Wyatt Earp himself was documented to be in Colorado as well during this period, though his whereabouts are less ironclad. Further dispelling this account is the fact that both of these men were wanted outlaws in Arizona at the time, with substantial bounties on their heads. The consensus from historians is now that Wyatt Earp simply fabricated this event, while he was building his own legend in the early 20th century. A far more plausible suspect was a man Ringo considered a friend, a very bad hombre named Buckskin Frank Leslie. Buckskin was a bartender, a scout, and a known psychopath who was, in essence, a serial predator before the terminology had been coined. The evidence against him is compelling. In November 1882, Leslie got into an argument with one of Ringo's good friends, a fellow outlaw named Billy Claiborne. To defend his honor, Buckskin promptly eliminated Claiborne, with some accounts having him finishing off the man in cold blood, even after he posed no threat. Claiborne's dying words to those around him made it clear that he had seen Buckskin shoot Ringo. Years later, while serving a sentence for slaying his wife, Buckskin reportedly confessed to a prison guard that he had, in fact, eliminated Ringo. According to this account, Buckskin, Claiborne, and Ringo were in the Turkey Creek area when the men got into an argument. Buckskin claimed he shot in self-defense, but this is a guy with a lot of bodies to his name, including completely innocent people, so take that with a grain of salt. A final, often overlooked suspect is a gambler named Michael O'Rourke. In 1881, O'Rourke eliminated a man in a nearby town over a minor disagreement, and an angry mob formed up to hunt him down. Johnny Ringo was amongst the members of this mob, and Wyatt Earp ended up stepping in to save O'Rourke's life. Under this theory, this gambler saved by Earp may have done a favor for him by taking out Johnny Ringo. While the motive is clear, the most persuasive evidence is what happened after Ringo's death. One of Ringo's closest friends later hunted down and slew Michael O'Rourke. According to some, this can be seen as a verdict delivered by way of Old West frontier justice. In the end, the death of Johnny Ringo remains an unsolvable case. The official verdict is supported by his psychological state, but contradicted by the bizarre physical evidence and circumstantial evidence. While the theory blaming Wyatt Earp directly is a fiction, the cases against Frank Leslie and Michael O'Rourke have significant circumstantial evidence in their favor. However, unless we have some unlikely new evidence that surfaces, such as a journal entry with a very direct confession that matches the evidence, the truth will remain an unsolved mystery. It begins with a photograph, as so many great mysteries do. Taken in February 1901 at DeYoung's studio in New York City's bustling Union Square, the portrait captures a man and a woman of striking confidence and style. He is handsome, well-dressed, and would soon be known to lawmen across 2 continents as Harry Longabaugh, the Sundance Kid. She's arrestingly beautiful, her expression poised and intelligent, and we know her as Etta Place, but if you asked her parents, that name would be out of place, because she wasn't born that way. Pinned to the lapel of her fashionable dress is a delicate gold watch from Tiffany's, a recent gift not from her companion, but from their partner in crime, Butch Cassidy. This small detail hints at the complex, 3-way partnership that defined their lives. The couple purchased 5 copies of the portrait, mailing them to family and friends as a de facto marriage announcement, though no official record of their union has ever been found. Days later, they, along with Cassidy, boarded the British steamship Herminius and sailed for Buenos Aires, fleeing the long arm of the law for a new life in Argentina. But what was intended as a private commemoration of their future soon became a weapon used against them. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency, relentless in its pursuit of the Wild Bunch, acquired a copy of the photograph. Almost overnight, the image was transformed from a personal token into the centerpiece of wanted posters, reproduced and distributed from the plains of Wyoming to the pampas of Patagonia. The very portrait meant to celebrate their bond became the primary tool that would hound them and ultimately contribute to its dissolution. This artifact is the perfect metaphor for Etta Place herself. It provides the most concrete proof of her existence, a clear and confident face staring out from the turn of the 20th century. Yet it tells us nothing of who she was before that moment or what became of her after. The photograph is both a window and a wall. It allows us to see her, making her vividly real, in a way other historical figures are not, but it captures a persona, an alias, at the very moment she was creating it. By disseminating this image, the Pinkertons effectively cemented the identity of Etta Place, while simultaneously erasing any trace of the woman she had been before. The photograph marks the beginning of her official story and the end of the trail to her origins. She stepped out of complete anonymity, lived in the historical spotlight for 5 years, and then vanished back into the mists. She left this single haunting image as the only definitive proof she was ever there at all. Every part of the identity we know was a careful construct, starting with the name itself. Place was the maiden name of Sundance's mother, a convenient alias he often used to cover his tracks. The name she actually used when signing hotel registers in the United States was Ethel. The Pinkertons believed her birth year was around 1878. However, it's unclear how they came to this conclusion, or if it was simply an educated guess based on her youthful appearance. Those who met her consistently remarked on a fascinating set of contradictions. She was described as cordial and refined, and spoke in an educated manner that suggested an East Coast background. Yet, this same woman was an expert writer and a crack shot with both a Roscoe and a rifle, skills more suited to the rugged frontier. This has led to historians trying to find any records of her birth or how she arrived in the West, and perhaps surprisingly, they have had some luck. Some stories suggest that she was a school teacher who was brought out from the East, while other stories suggest that she was working in society's oldest profession. And perhaps surprisingly, these two personas and professions aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, and there's actually some decent circumstantial evidence for it. In fact, the most plausible, though still unproven theory about her identity provides a compelling synthesis of both narratives. The 1900 census records for San Antonio list a woman named Ethel Bishop, living in a house of ill repute often visited by Butch, Sundance, and the Wild Bunch. Crucially, her occupation is listed as unemployed music teacher, suggesting that she fell upon hard times. By early 1901, the pressure from the Pinkertons had become immense. Following a string of audacious train and bank robberies, the Wild Bunch was the most wanted gang in America, and their world was shrinking. Butch, Sundance, and Etta made a bold decision. They would flee the country and start over. After their stop in New York City for photos and fine jewelry, they set sail for South America in 1901. Their destination was both a hideout and a place of reinvention. Using the substantial profits from their last robberies, they purchased a sprawling ranch in the remote Cholula Valley of Patagonia in Argentina. They intended to go straight, and Etta herself held title to more than 2,000 acres in her own name. For a time, the remains of the Wild Bunch became the Mild Bunch, probably more concerned about the price fluctuations of beef and grain than any passing trains laden with riches. Surprisingly, given the time involved, they traveled back to America on a couple of occasions. But by 1905, things were looking rough, and the law had caught up to them. They fled from Argentina into Chile, seeking refuge in the shadow of the Andes Mountains. Here they resorted back to their old ways, with Etta participating in a bank robbery in 1905. But simply put, she was over it, and by 1906, she had made her decision. Well, that's what historians assume, since all evidence suggests that Sundance didn't want to lose her. Sundance escorted her back to the United States, a clear sign that she was the one who initiated the final separation. In June of that year, he accompanied her on the long sea voyage from Chile to San Francisco. After seeing her settled, he turned around and sailed back to South America alone. He would be eliminated within 2 years, reportedly cut down alongside Butch Cassidy in a firefight with Bolivian soldiers in November 1908. Etta, however, didn't vanish the moment she stepped off the boat. Her last confirmed location was still in San Francisco in 1907, a full year after her arrival. The final tantalizing ripple from her life appeared in 1909. A woman matching Etta's description approached the U.S. Vice Consul in Chile, requesting assistance in obtaining a death certificate for one Harry Longabaugh. No certificate could be issued, and the woman's identity was never officially confirmed, though the vice consul was familiar with her appearance from the wanted posters. But if it was Etta, this act represents the final, logical step in a carefully planned exit. For over a century, the vacuum left by Etta Place's disappearance has been filled with speculation. The most popular and enduring theory was that Etta Place was actually Ann Bassett, the queen of the cattle rustlers from Colorado. The case was compelling. Bassett was born in the same year as Etta, ran with the Wild Bunch, was romantically linked to Butch Cassidy, and was also a skilled rider and shooter. Most convincingly, she bore a striking physical resemblance to Etta. In the 90s, a computer facial recognition analysis performed by a scientist at Los Alamos National Laboratory concluded they were almost certainly the same person. However, the theory collapses under the weight of contemporary evidence. A comparison of their timelines, based on legal documents and contemporary newspaper reports, proves they were two different women in two different places at the same time. To give just one example, Ann Bassett was standing trial in Wyoming for cattle rustling at a point in 1904 when Etta Place was documented to have been in South America. Some have made pretty wild claims about the use of body doubles, or claimed that Etta could have made it back to stand trial, both of which strike me as incredibly unlikely. Bassett lived a long and public life until her death in 1956, never once claiming to be Etta Place, even in her own memoirs. Anyway, I've put up the only known photographs of each woman side by side, and personally I think there's a pretty strong resemblance. But the other facts just don't add up. The second major theory identified Etta as Eunice Gray, a woman who ran a house of ill repute and later a hotel in Fort Worth, Texas. This theory was championed by a local newspaper editor who noted that Gray claimed to have spent time in South America for her health during the same period Etta was there. For decades, the lack of a photograph of a young Eunice Gray kept the theory alive. That changed in 2007 when a researcher located photographs of her, and they really don't look anything alike at all. However, it's always possible that a photograph could have been incorrectly marked or cataloged, meaning that this photograph may not depict Eunice Gray. Unlike Butch and Sundance, whose story has a likely finale in Bolivia, Etta's story simply stops. After 1909, she simply vanishes from the record, and there's nothing further to indicate what actually happened to her. Personally, I suspect that she may have simply stayed somewhere in South America, given that she was a high-profile wanted fugitive in the United States. That said, her status as a fugitive in America didn't stop her from coming back to the country previously. Further, it's always possible that she simply got tied up with the wrong sort of people in South America. Etta Place clearly wasn't the sort of person who contented herself with living a normal life, and it's very possible that she may have come to harm from one of the people she met. At the end of the day, the disappearance of Etta Place will likely continue to remain one of the Old West's unsolved mysteries. That said, I have a faint hope that eventually we'll find a diary attributed to her, or someone close to her, that may break the whole historical cold case wide open. Imagine a brilliant physicist spoken of in the same breath as Galileo and Newton, stepping onto a ship one evening and vanishing without a trace. This is exactly what happened in 1938 when Ettore Majorana, a prodigious Italian scientist, disappeared under eerie circumstances. But this isn't your usual missing person case, and it turns out that there's very good evidence to suggest he actually lived his life out half a world away. Ettore Majorana was born in Catania, Sicily, on August 5, 1906, into a well-off family of intellectuals. From a young age, he showed exceptional, and perhaps even prodigious, mathematical talent. He initially pursued engineering at university, likely due to his father's influence, but ultimately switched to physics, where he fell into the circle of legendary physicist Enrico Fermi. Majorana quickly stood out even among these bright minds, astonishing peers and mentors with elegant solutions to tough problems. His contributions to theoretical physics were profound, though he had little interest in publishing papers. He tackled quantum theory and subatomic particles, and he even anticipated the existence of the neutron before it was officially discovered. Majorana's modesty and reluctance to publish meant he only authored 9 scientific papers in his life, but those few works left an enduring legacy. Despite, or perhaps because of, his brilliance, Majorana became increasingly reclusive and troubled in the mid-1930s. After a fruitful period working with renowned physicists like Werner Heisenberg in Germany and Niels Bohr in Copenhagen, Majorana returned to Italy with a growing sense of isolation. He saw his own work as trivial and was often reluctant to share his breakthroughs. Friends and colleagues noted that he withdrew from social life. For several years, he largely shut himself away, avoiding even close family and friends. In late 1937, however, he took a post as a full professor of theoretical physics at the University of Naples, an extraordinary appointment for a 31-year-old. This role brought him out of isolation briefly, as he began teaching in early 1938. Yet, those around him could see he was not at ease. Majorana was devoutly Catholic and prone to what have been called mystical crises, and he seemed burdened by internal conflicts. These personal struggles, which may be viewed as bouts of acute mental illness, foreshadowed the dramatic steps he would soon take. In late March 1938, Majorana's inner turmoil came to a head. Without warning, he withdrew all the money from his bank account and even collected back pay he had never bothered to pick up, signs that he was putting his affairs in order. On March 25, 1938, Majorana left Naples, likely aboard the steamer Città di Palermo, bound for Sicily. Before departing, he penned a cryptic letter to his colleague and friend Antonio Carelli, the director of the Naples Physics Institute. In this note, Majorana stated he had made an unavoidable decision and apologized for the trouble his sudden disappearance would cause. He asked Carelli to remember him kindly to colleagues and students, hinting that by the time the letter was read, he might already be gone. This sounded ominously like a farewell. Yet the very same evening, Majorana sent a follow-up telegram from Palermo in Sicily that baffled everyone. It said that the sea had quote-unquote rejected him and that he'd be heading back tomorrow. This dramatic phrase suggested that Majorana had a serious change of heart. Some interpret it to mean he might have tried eliminating himself by jumping into the sea during the voyage, but then survived or reconsidered. True to his word, he appeared to purchase a return ticket and may have boarded a ship back to Naples on March 26th. In fact, there were unconfirmed reports that colleagues saw him on the Naples-bound boat or back in Naples shortly thereafter. However, after that point, Ettore Majorana was never seen again in the official record. When he failed to reappear, his family and friends panicked. Majorana's disappearance was reported to the authorities, and an intensive search was launched both in Sicily and on the Italian mainland. The news that such a famed physicist had vanished triggered a massive response. Majorana's family, colleagues, and the Italian police undertook a frantic search, scouring passenger lists, ports, and coastlines for any trace of him. Even Majorana's mentor Enrico Fermi intervened at the highest levels. Fermi, who deeply appreciated Majorana's unique genius, reportedly told his wife that if Ettore had decided to disappear, he was clever enough that no one would ever find him. Notably, this statement has later been interpreted as indicating that Fermi may have known more than he was letting on, as you'll see shortly. Despite this grim acknowledgement of Majorana's cunning, Fermi was determined to try. He even appealed to Italy's leader Benito Mussolini to dedicate government resources to finding the missing scientist. Convincing Mussolini that this was a matter of national security, an extensive manhunt ensued. Ships and hospitals were checked, and the Italian Navy combed the sea routes, but nothing concrete emerged. The only clues left behind were Majorana's haunting letters. In his hotel room in Naples, a short note addressed to his family was found. It told them not to mourn him in traditional black clothing, perhaps signifying that he had simply disappeared and wasn't actually deceased. Over the ensuing decades, numerous theories emerged to explain what might have happened to the vanishing genius. One popular idea is that Majorana foresaw the destructive power of nuclear physics and chose to disappear to avoid any role in it. While Majorana's colleagues like Fermi did go on to work on the Manhattan Project, there's no direct evidence that Majorana himself voiced such fears before he vanished. Still, the timing and his brilliance make this theory enticing, a genius fleeing the future he predicted. Over the years, there were numerous reported sightings of Majorana in places like Argentina and Venezuela. Some hypothesized that he secretly fled Italy, possibly motivated by guilt or a desire to live anonymously, far from the looming conflict in Europe. In fact, in the 1950s, an Italian television claimed to have tracked him down to Venezuela, where he was living a simple life under an assumed identity. The only problem with this theory, though, is that they decided to continue to let him live his life of quiet anonymity. Some have speculated that the producers could have simply made up this narrative for a television series, given the popularity of the case in Italy. That said, of course, it's also possible that they did track him down, and that they chose to respect his wishes. I'll come back to this theory in a moment, though, since there was a recent explosive development relating to that Italian documentary. Others, of course, believe that Majorana may have simply ended his own life, though this theory has been hotly contested. Majorana's devout Catholic faith and the absence of a body, as well as the note telling his family not to mourn in black, are all factors against this. Further, there's also the fact that he appears to have rejected the idea of ending himself when he came back from Sicily. A theory favored by Majorana's own family was that he suffered a spiritual or existential crisis and retreated to a monastery in Italy. Given his religious devotion, they speculated he might have chosen a life of seclusion and contemplation over fame. Indeed, his priest and confessor hinted that Ettore had experienced deep mystical episodes and may have had other plans for his life. Naturally, though, this priest couldn't come out and say what happened even if he knew what did, so long as the context of what was said was during confession. This theory portrays Majorana's disappearance almost as a deliberate act of spiritual exile, mirroring the idea of the more physical self-exile from Italy. Like with Fermi, the fact that his confessor gave this cryptic statement has been viewed as somewhat unusual in light of subsequent happenings. There were even darker speculations that Majorana might have been kidnapped or killed because of the sensitive knowledge he possessed. Some wondered if agents of a foreign power, or even shadowy elements within Italy, abducted him to prevent his intellect from aiding another country's atomic projects. Given that Majorana would have almost certainly been working on the Manhattan Project if he had followed Fermi to America, this idea has gathered a lot of steam. That said, while it may be interesting to speculate about, there's no evidence whatsoever to suggest this was the case. Remarkably, the case saw a revival in the 21st century when new clues emerged. In 2011, an elderly witness came forward in Italy claiming not only to have seen Majorana alive in the late 1940s, but even to have befriended him in Buenos Aires. This prompted the Rome Attorney's Office to officially reopen the investigation 73 years after Majorana vanished. Soon, a photograph surfaced, allegedly showing Majorana, under the name Mr. Beanie, living in Valencia in Venezuela in 1955. Forensic analysts compared this photo with images of Majorana and found a number of striking similarities in facial features. Also, if you're one of those people who just listens, this may be a good time to take a look and see if you can see the resemblance between the two men. Adding to the intrigue, reports emerged of a postcard written by Majorana's uncle that was purportedly found among the belongings of this mysterious individual. These pieces of evidence strongly suggested that Majorana had survived and lived in South America under an assumed identity. Following these developments, Italian authorities announced an official conclusion. In February 2015, the Rome Attorney's Office declared that he likely lived abroad in Venezuela, at least from 1955 to 1959. No criminal act was identified. In other words, the investigation found that Majorana likely chose to remove himself from his former life. With that statement, the decades-old case was closed from a legal standpoint. It's an astonishing outcome. After so many years of uncertainty, the authorities essentially concluded that the genius physicist quietly lived out his life in obscurity. The official verdict has not put an end to the fascination with Majorana's story. Even if he did live incognito in Venezuela, many unanswered questions remain. Why would a scientist of Majorana's caliber abandon a promising career and family to live in hiding? Was he truly driven by a moral objection to nuclear weapons, overwhelming anxiety, or something else we may never understand? It's also unknown what ultimately became of him after 1959. If he lived longer, he appears to have kept an exceedingly low profile. In 2025, nearly 87 years after he vanished, an Italian court finally declared Ettore Majorana presumed dead, providing legal closure to his status. For more than 30 years after 1930, a lone woman would slip into a quiet Greenwich Village bar every August 6th and order 2 cocktails. She would raise one glass in a silent toast to her absent companion, then depart, leaving the second drink untouched. The woman was Stella Crater, and the toast was for her missing husband, Judge Joseph Force Crater, who vanished on a warm summer night in 1930 and never returned. Crater's disappearance shocked the nation and became an instant media sensation. To this day, what happened to Judge Crater remains one of America's most notorious unsolved mysteries, a true tale of a man who stepped into a taxi and was never seen again. Joseph Force Crater was no ordinary missing person. He was a prominent New York judge and attorney at the height of a successful career. Born in 1889 to Irish immigrant parents in Pennsylvania, Crater climbed the ranks of the legal world through talent and political savvy. He practiced law in Manhattan and became deeply involved with Tammany Hall, the powerful Democratic political machine that dominated New York City politics. Through his work with Tammany leader Martin Healy, Crater earned lucrative court appointments, and cultivated influential connections. In one notable case in 1929, he handled a hotel foreclosure that led to a spectacular profit for a well-connected buyer, raising eyebrows about insider deal-making in Crater's circle. By 1930, Crater's loyalty and networking paid off. Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt appointed him to fill a vacancy on the New York State Supreme Court, a prestigious judgeship, in April of that year. At just 41 years old, Crater was considered very young for the position and was seen as a rising star in New York's judiciary, backed by both political patronage and genuine ability. Justice Crater was even seen as someone who may eventually make it onto the Supreme Court one day. Despite his marriage to Stella, Judge Crater had a reputation as a man about town, and he had no problem doing a little bit of pipe-fitting work on the side. Tall, well-dressed, and sociable, he loved the nightlife of jazz-age New York. Friends nicknamed him Good Time Joe for his penchant for piano playing, dancing, and mingling with showgirls and Broadway speakeasies. He moved in both high society and more unsavory circles, rubbing elbows with politicians, business magnates, and the occasional gangster. In the summer of 1930, only months after Crater joined the state Supreme Court, trouble was brewing in New York's halls of power. The Manhattan District Attorney had launched a corruption inquiry into Tammany Hall's practice of selling judgeships to the highest bidder. Judge Crater appeared unperturbed at first, vacationing with Stella at their lakeside summer home in Maine. But on August 3, 1930, Crater received an urgent phone call and abruptly announced to his wife that he had to return to the city to straighten things out. He promised to be back in Maine in time for Stella's birthday on August 9th. In reality, instead of immediately tending to any official business, Crater detoured to the beach resort of Atlantic City with a young showgirl, Sally Lou Ritz, in tow. And yeah, since I can't resist a good bit of humor, it appears that the good judge was straightening certain things out, at the very least. This secret jaunt with a chorus girl would only come to light later, hinting that Crater had personal matters, or pleasures, occupying his time even as political storms gathered. Judge Crater arrived back in Manhattan on August 6, 1930, the last day he was seen alive. That morning, he went into his chambers at the courthouse and spent a couple of hours methodically sorting through his files, even reportedly destroying some documents. He had his assistant cash 2 checks for him and withdrew the modern equivalent of almost $100,000. Crater and the assistant then brought 2 locked briefcases from his office to his apartment, after which the judge dismissed his aide for the day. These actions later struck investigators as suspicious, as if Crater were tying up loose ends or stashing something important. That evening, Judge Crater continued his routine of enjoying the town. He purchased a ticket for a new Broadway comedy at the Belasco Theater, and then headed to dinner at Billy Hass's Chop House on West 45th Street. His dining companions were William Klein, a fellow lawyer and friend, and the ever-present Sally Lou Ritz, the showgirl from his Atlantic City trip. The trio ate, drank, and laughed together, with Crater reportedly in fine spirits. Sometime around 9 that evening, as the group stood outside the restaurant, Crater hailed a taxicab passing by. No one would ever definitively see Judge Joseph Crater again. At first, no alarm was raised, and when Crater failed to return to Maine for Stella's birthday, she grew annoyed, but assumed her husband's work had delayed him. Crater's colleagues in New York also thought little of his absence, believing he was still vacationing in Maine. Only after a week passed with no word did Stella begin making anxious phone calls to friends in the city, searching for any sign of him. On August 25th, the New York courts reopened for a new term and were notably 1 judge short. Crater's fellow justices, realizing he was neither in Maine nor at work, initiated quiet inquiries into his whereabouts. When these discreet efforts turned up nothing, The police were finally notified on September 3rd, 1930. The story of the missing judge hit the front pages the next day, and a frenzy of speculation ensued. A massive investigation swung into motion. Detectives discovered that Crater's personal safe deposit box had been mysteriously emptied, and those 2 briefcases he'd taken home had vanished without a trace. These leads went nowhere, however, as tips and alleged sightings of the missing judge flooded in from all over. In October 1930, a grand jury was impaneled to examine the case in exhaustive detail. 95 witnesses were called and nearly 1,000 pages of testimony collected. The inquiry delved into Crater's bank records, phone calls, and relationships, trying to piece together a puzzle with precious few pieces. Throughout, Stella Crater remained in Maine, refusing to face what she considered accusatory treatment by authorities and scandal-hungry newspapers. In January 1931, after months of hearings, the grand jury concluded its investigation with a frustrating shrug. In short, they couldn't say if he was alive or dead, let alone what caused his disappearance. In a bizarre twist, just days after the grand jury disbanded, Stella Crater made a discovery that only deepened the mystery. While cleaning out her husband's dresser back in their New York apartment, she found a secret compartment containing 4 envelopes. Inside were stacks of stocks and bonds, checks, life insurance papers, and Crater's will, all documents that had been missed in prior police searches. There was also a handwritten note from Crater himself. In it, the judge had listed various debts owed to him and included a brief, poignant message to Stella that hinted at his despair and ended with a loving goodbye. The cache suggested that Crater might have anticipated some trouble, but it yielded no concrete clues as to his fate. He was officially declared dead in absentia in 1939, allowing Stella to collect life insurance. Decades later, in 1979, the NYPD finally closed the case without resolution. From the moment the story broke in 1930, the disappearance of Judge Crater generated a whirlwind of theories. Over the years, professional investigators and amateur sleuths alike have proposed many possible explanations, each as compelling as it is unprovable. The tale has all the ingredients of a great mystery, including political intrigue, gangsters, showgirls, and a man who seemingly evaporated into thin air. One early theory was that Crater chose to vanish of his own accord. It seemed implausible that a man of his stature would abandon his career and wife without a word. Yet some pointed to the large sum of cash he withdrew and the documents he took as signs of a planned getaway. In the years after 1930, reported Crater sightings cropped up across the country and even overseas, fueling the idea that he might still be alive under an assumed identity. Tipsters claimed to have seen a man resembling Crater in far-flung locales ranging from rural Canada to the South Pacific. Carnival workers, gold prospectors, and even a man in the French Foreign Legion were rumored to be the missing judge in disguise. Another theory suggested Crater met with an accidental death that was then covered up. For example, lurid rumors hinted he might have suffered a heart attack in the company of a lady of the night, and any witnesses disposed of the body rather than face scandal. After all, Crater was known for enjoying good times, so this didn't seem too unlikely. Given Judge Crater's ties to Tammany Hall and the timing of his disappearance, many have suspected that political corruption was at the heart of this mystery. Crater had been a cog in Tammany's powerful machine, and he literally owed his judgeship to their influence. He likely knew about the murky transactions involved in buying and selling public offices. In mid-1930, a state investigation was zeroing in on Tammany's judicial corruption, and Crater's mentor, Martin Healy, was under scrutiny. The theory goes that Crater might have been ready to talk, or at least that others feared he would talk. Eliminating the judge could have been a convenient way for higher-ups to protect themselves. Some even whispered of a connection to Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was then New York's governor and had presidential ambitions. The logic being that if a scandal about selling judgeships blew up, it could tarnish Roosevelt on the national stage. Notably, years later, foes of Roosevelt would insinuate that FDR's allies knew more about Crater's fate, darkly suggesting that he knew where the body was. While there's no proof of any connection to Tammany Hall, this powerful and corrupt organization had benefited from extrajudicial usage of force in the past. Closely intertwined with the political angle is the possibility that organized crime figures played a role. New York's underworld and its political world were often two sides of the same coin in that era. Judge Crater was known to enjoy late nights in the city's clubs and had rubbed shoulders with some infamous characters. He was friendly with Irish gangster Jack Diamond and distraught over the 1928 slaying of his acquaintance Arnold Rothstein. Such connections have long fed the theory that Crater knew too much about the criminal underbelly of the city. Perhaps he stumbled into information that made him a liability, or perhaps someone in the mob felt the judge hadn't delivered on a promise. Another set of theories suggests that he was blackmailed by someone he was having an affair with, or a woman of whom he was a regular client. Under this theory, he had routinely been paying off large amounts of hush money to this woman in exchange for her silence. However, it's speculated that the last payment was insufficient, and she had a local gangster take him out. Personally, I don't find this narrative to be incredibly compelling, since if it's true, she permanently cut off the source of her extortion. After all, he was a politically well-connected judge, and he would have further money or influence to extort in the future. Simply put, I think this is likely just a lurid theory that was drummed up to sell newspapers back in the day. For decades, the mystery of Judge Crater remained stubbornly unsolved until a stunning potential clue emerged 75 years later. In August 2005, New York authorities announced they had obtained new evidence in the cold case. A handwritten letter left by a 91-year-old widow named Stella Ferrucci Good. This woman had been the wife of a detective, and in a letter opened after she had perished, she revealed an explosive story her husband had allegedly told her. According to Ferrucci Good's letter, Judge Crater had indeed been slain back in 1930, not by mobsters or jilted lovers, but by two men, one of them who wore a badge. The letter named a New York City police officer, Charles Burns, and his brother Frank, who happened to be a cab driver. On the night of August 6, 1930, the story went, the Burns brothers somehow intercepted Crater. They eliminated the judge, and then buried his body under the Coney Island boardwalk in Brooklyn. Incredibly, the letter also tied Charles Burns to other violence of the era. Investigators in 2005 were initially intrigued, and they noted the area mentioned. West 8th Street on Coney Island, now the site of the New York Aquarium, had indeed been excavated during construction in the 1950s. And actually, let me just jump in here for a second, since as I was doing the editing on this video, I realized something. Coney Island isn't an actual island anymore, and hasn't been one for well over a century when an engineering project connected it to Brooklyn. Anyway, if a skeleton had been found then, it was never reported. Police records showed no such discovery, and a preliminary check of municipal works didn't turn up any bones either. This late-breaking confession left more questions than answers. No one could say if the detective's tale was true, or if it was just a fanciful story that he told to his wife. Since Stella had already passed away by the time the letter was opened, there was no opportunity to question her about the contents of the letter. Further yet, the evidence is hearsay from a person who isn't even alive, giving evidence about a supposed conversation with another person who also isn't alive. This is, of course, extremely problematic, as aside from confirming that her husband was indeed a police officer, nothing else could be known for certain. Stella herself could have simply been an avid follower of the case with a bit of a sick sense of humor, looking to insert herself into the investigation from beyond the grave. And if that was her intent, well, then she definitely succeeded. At any rate, no physical evidence was recovered to substantiate the claim, and skeptics pointed out inconsistencies. In the years following Crater's disappearance, his name became a punchline and a piece of Americana, even as his wife quietly kept her vow to never forget him. The very phrase, "to pull a crater," entered the lexicon as slang for vanishing without a trace. And from my research, it looks as though this phrase would have essentially been used in the same way we use the phrase ghosting today. Whatever the case, Justice Crater's disappearance likely remains such a popular unsolved mystery because there are so many possibilities as to what happened. Further, some of these possibilities credibly intersect with big names in both New York history and American history. Amelia Earhart was more than a pioneering aviator. She was an American icon. Born in Kansas in 1897 with an adventurous spirit, she took to the skies in her 20s and quickly broke barriers in the male-dominated field of aviation. In 1932, Earhart became the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean, a feat that made headlines worldwide. She went on to set numerous records, including a solo flight from Hawaii to California, and her charisma and courage made her an international celebrity. Using her fame to champion women's opportunities in aviation, Earhart became a symbol of bravery and new possibilities for a generation of young women. By 1937, Earhart had set her sights on her most ambitious journey yet, a flight around the world at the equator. She and navigator Fred Noonan planned to circumnavigate the globe in a twin-engine Lockheed Electra, making stops to refuel along the way. After nearly completing the arduous trek from Miami through South America, Africa, India, and Southeast Asia, they reached Lae in New Guinea. On July 2nd, 1937, they departed Lae for a tiny speck of land in the Pacific, Howland Island, which was to be their next refueling stop. A U.S. Coast Guard ship, the Ithaca, waited off Howland to guide them in by radio. But as Earhart's plane neared the area, she radioed that she was low on fuel and couldn't find Howland. The Ithaca could hear her transmissions, but she couldn't hear their replies. Earhart's last known message described a navigational line she was following, followed by silence. An extensive search by the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard, the largest of its kind at the time, scoured the ocean around Howland Island and beyond for weeks. However, they found no trace of the plane or its crew. With nothing to show for their efforts, officials concluded that the aircraft had simply run out of fuel and crashed at sea. This crash and sink explanation was accepted as the likely end of her journey. Yet the lack of concrete evidence left room for doubt, and over the years, a number of alternative theories emerged to fill that void. What follows are the leading theories about what might have happened on that fateful day in 1937. The most straightforward theory is that Amelia Earhart's Lockheed Electra ran out of fuel near Howland Island and fell into the Pacific Ocean. In this scenario, Earhart and Noonan, unable to spot their tiny target island, would have been forced down into open water once their fuel was exhausted. A water landing in rough seas could have torn the plane apart or sent it straight to the ocean floor. Given the vast expanse of the Pacific and its strong currents, it's not surprising that searchers in 1937 found no trace of debris. Earhart's final radio calls support this idea. She never mentioned seeing land, and her last reported navigation line would have carried the plane far past Howland into empty ocean. Many historians have long considered the crash at sea narrative the most plausible explanation. Another theory proposes that Earhart and Noonan might have landed safely on an uninhabited coral atoll, then called Gardner Island, now called Nikumaroro. According to this theory, the pair survived there for some time as castaways. The idea is that when they couldn't find Howland, Earhart turned the plane southeast along the line she had mentioned in her last transmission, hoping to find land. Gardner Island lies about 350 miles in that direction. In 1937 it was deserted, but it offered a long flat reef at low tide that could have been used as an emergency runway. It's conceivable that Earhart spotted this island, brought the plane down on the reef, and sent out distress radio calls until the rising tide swept the plane into the sea. In fact, in the days after the disappearance, some radio stations picked up faint distress signals that were never fully explained. In 1940, a British officer discovered skeletal remains on the island, along with a portion of a shoe and some navigational equipment. At the time, investigators concluded the bones were from a man who didn't meet the description of Noonan, and were obviously not from Earhart, and the remains were unfortunately lost. However, modern analysis of the original bone measurements suggests they could have belonged to a woman of European descent about Earhart's height. Unfortunately, this was based upon a reanalysis of the measurements from 1940, not a re-examination of the bones themselves as they were lost. Had the bones been maintained, it may have been possible to tie them to Earhart's family through forensic genetic genealogy. Unfortunately, unless these lost remains are recovered, we simply don't have this luxury. A very different hypothesis is that Earhart's final landing wasn't on a friendly island at all, but in territory controlled by Japan, leading to her capture. In 1937, Japan administered the Marshall Islands in the Pacific, not far north of Earhart's intended route. Some believe that Earhart and Noonan, unable to find Howland, might have drifted off course and ended up in the Marshalls. According to this theory, the Japanese military would have taken them into custody, possibly suspecting them of espionage, given rising pre-war tensions. Indeed, over the years, a few islanders and U.S. servicemen claimed they had seen or heard of two American flyers held by the Japanese before World War II. One persistent rumor placed Earhart on Saipan as a prisoner. However, no credible documentation has ever surfaced to support these claims. In fact, a blurry photograph emerged in 2017 that supposedly showed Earhart and Noonan in Japanese custody. A History Channel show called Amelia Earhart, The Lost Evidence, claimed that the photograph was taken in 1937. However, after the claim was made, a Japanese blogger found that the photograph actually came from a book published in 1935, 2 years prior to the disappearance of Earhart and Noonan. Whatever the case, the disappearance of Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan remains one of the most famous and haunting mysterious disappearances in history. In late 1809, as the Napoleonic Wars ravaged Europe, a 25-year-old British diplomat named Benjamin Bathurst set out on a tense journey home. Bathurst was the well-connected son of a bishop, and already a seasoned envoy despite his age. He had just left Vienna, where he'd tried in vain to draw Austria into an alliance against Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, with Austria defeated, Bathurst feared French spies were on his trail. Disguised as a humble merchant and traveling under a false name, he planned to slip north through Prussia to the port of Hamburg and sail back to England. It was a risky route. The roads were crawling with bandits and stray soldiers, and every town posed new dangers for a lone British envoy behind enemy lines. On the evening of November 25th, 1809, Bathurst's carriage halted at the Prussian town of Perleberg for a brief rest. He and his courier, a man named Herr Kraus, had dinner at the White Swan Inn, while fresh horses were being readied for the next leg of their trip. Bathurst was cautious. He had decided to depart under cover of darkness, hoping the night would cloak his passage. Ever on edge, he peered into the gloom and was wary of every flicker of shadow around the inn yard. At around 9 p.m., with the carriage waiting in the lamplit courtyard, Bathurst donned his heavy fur coat and stepped outside. Witnesses later recalled seeing him walk around to the front of his horses, perhaps to inspect the team or speak to the carriage driver. In that fleeting moment, the young diplomat vanished. When Kraus emerged moments later, there was no sign of Bathurst anywhere. One moment Bathurst was there beside the horses, the next he had melted into the shadows without a sound. Local authorities were notified, but in the chaos of Napoleonic-era Prussia, a missing traveler raised little alarm at first. However, when the Prussians, who were officially neutral at this point, learned that the man wasn't a merchant, but a British diplomat, this caught the attention of the local authorities. By the next day, Captain Friedrich von Klitzing had soldiers dragging the nearby river and combing Perleberg for any trace of the Englishman. Their search soon turned up disturbing clues. Bathurst's fur-lined cloak was found hidden in a stable behind a house owned by an inn worker. 2 weeks later, a pair of his trousers surfaced in the woods outside town. Oddly, the pants had strange holes in them and contained papers including a letter to Bathurst's wife, but there were no bloodstains. It looked like someone had fired shots through the clothing after removing it, perhaps to fake a violent ambush. Suspicion ended up falling on a member of the inn's staff, August Schmidt. He was caught with the missing coat and promptly arrested, but no body or weapon was found, and he was eventually released without charges. And I just have to mention it here, but this expensive coat was found in an outhouse owned by the Schmidt family. So yeah, sometimes the comedy just writes itself, doesn't it? Desperate for answers, Bathurst's wife, Phillida, traveled to Prussia and even secured an audience with Napoleon Bonaparte to ask if he knew of her husband's fate. Napoleon solemnly denied any French involvement, and indeed no hard evidence ever tied French agents to the disappearance. The Prussian king and British government posted hefty rewards for information, yet every lead turned cold. As the winter of 1809 wore on, Benjamin Bathurst had effectively vanished without a trace, leaving behind only unanswered questions. In the absence of a definitive answer, numerous theories emerged to explain his disappearance. The simplest and most mundane explanation is that Bathurst was robbed and slain by opportunists. He was traveling with conspicuous wealth, a fine coat, jewelry, money, through an area that had been impoverished by war. It's easy to imagine him stepping away from the inn's lights and being ambushed in the darkness by thieves. The suspicious conduct of the inn's employees, and the fact that the wealth seems to have been distributed amongst them, supports this idea. The fact that he wasn't openly traveling as a diplomat also lends some additional credibility to the theory. I imagine the inn staff would have seen a wealthy merchant as much easier pickings than an influential and well-connected British diplomat on official business on the continent. But guys, I'm going to dox myself a bit here. I'm not a Prussian waiter at an inn circa the Napoleonic era, so this is just speculation on my part. I know some of you are probably shocked right now, but yeah, I just got to speak my truth. Years later, in 1852, workers demolishing a nearby building discovered a human skeleton buried under a threshold, the skull split by a heavy blow. Many believed that Bathurst had finally been found, though at the time there was no way to prove this was him and the evidence wasn't preserved. At the time, public opinion favored a more conspiratorial view, that Bathurst was the victim of an attack by French agents. As a British envoy working against Napoleon, he could have been targeted. British newspapers loudly accused Napoleon's spies of abducting Bathurst, suggesting he'd been seized and quietly eliminated on official orders. The French government angrily refuted these charges, instead insinuating that Bathurst had gone insane. The French government further accused the British diplomatic service of routinely employing people who are in poor mental health. They even released an official statement saying that the British diplomatic service is well known worldwide for employing madmen, which I suppose passed for 19th century French banter. Despite extensive diplomatic inquiries, no proof ever emerged that France captured or in any other way interfered with Bathurst. As I mentioned earlier, Napoleon personally guaranteed to Bathurst's wife that Bathurst hadn't been harmed by French agents. Given the context at the time, this didn't satisfy many in Britain. However, these inquiries were raised again after Napoleon's fall, and again officials denied all involvement in the disappearance. Further, historians find it highly unlikely that Napoleon would have ordered a diplomat to be abducted and slain. The reasoning for this is grounded in practicality. All sides in any conflict know that diplomats are necessary, and neither side wishes to have their people treated in such a way. Another theory suggests that Bathurst took the opportunity to leave his life behind and live on the continent. Under intense stress and fearing for his life, it's possible he suffered a mental breakdown or decided to desert his mission. Friends noted that in his final days, he was extremely anxious, even paranoid, about being followed. Indeed, the letter Bathurst left for his wife, recovered from his abandoned trousers, was reportedly disjointed and desperate, as if he felt surrounded by enemies. Perhaps he lost his nerve and fled into hiding. One rumor claimed that an unidentified Englishman fitting Bathurst's description turned up in a Baltic port that winter, refusing to give his name, and boarded a ship for Sweden. According to this unverified narrative, the vessel sank in a storm. Despite the intense stress he was under, most experts agree that there's simply no indication that he chose to willingly run off. Notably, in modern times, the story of Benjamin Bathurst has found new life, with an infusion of paranormal influence. Given that he disappeared under such bizarre circumstances, some have speculated that he may have slipped through time. That said, ultimately, there's no indication that such an event ever occurred. Over 2 centuries later, the disappearance of Benjamin Bathurst remains an enduring mystery. The most likely conclusion, that he was slain by local robbers in Prussia, is also the least sensational, but it fits best with the sparse facts we have. Yet without definitive proof or witnesses, absolute certainty has eluded all investigations. No culprit was ever identified, and no grave was ever officially confirmed. The greatest mystery in modern British history doesn't involve complex espionage or an elaborate heist. Instead, it began with a British lord, a heavy lead pipe, and Sandra Rivet, an unfortunate nanny caught up in a dispute which she had no part in. Imagine the scene. A man who was a peer of the realm, vanishing overnight from the heart of London, leaving behind an act of horrifying evil. This was the fate of Richard John Bingham, the 7th Earl of Lucan, better known to the world and to history as Lord Lucan. He was a dashing, charismatic aristocrat, a fixture of high society, so effortlessly suave, he was reportedly considered for the role of James Bond. Yet, on the night of November 7th, 1974, that gilded image dissolved into a terrifying reality. Lucan's high social standing and the brutality of the crime instantly guaranteed the scandal's status as a global phenomenon. What followed was an intense and unsuccessful manhunt, followed by decades of rampant speculation. The mystery of Lord Lucan endures not because the facts are scarce, but because the truth remains trapped between the evidence and the tantalizing possibility of a high society conspiracy. To understand the disappearance, we must first look at the man behind it all. Richard John Bingham, who held the title of Lord Lucan, had a typical aristocratic upbringing, attending Eton College and serving briefly with the legendary Coldstream Guards. Following his military service, he became a banker in London. However, he quickly gave up this career to dedicate himself fully to high-stakes gambling. He became an early and persistent member of the exclusive group of wealthy gamblers at the Claremont Club, where his expensive tastes were well known. Despite adopting the nickname Lucky Lucan, his luck was decidedly finite, and the name became ironic. His losses were crushing, and he ran up immense gambling debts, sometimes losing amounts as high as £10,000, forcing his uncle to intervene to cover his creditors. While he continued to live the high life in both Britain and the United States for a few years, the reality of his financial insolvency eventually caught up with him. His personal life was similarly troubled. Lucan's marriage to Veronica Duncan, which began in 1963, soon became characterized as grimly unhappy. Veronica struggled with mental health issues, including anxiety and postnatal depression, following the births of their 3 children. By late 1972, the relationship had collapsed, and Lucan moved out of the family home at 46 Lower Belgrave Street. Keep that address in mind, because it's going to come up again. This separation sparked an intensely bitter and public custody battle over their children. The subsequent court ruling in 1974 proved devastating to the Earl. Despite doctors testifying that Lady Lucan was suffering from depression, the judge ultimately granted her full custody, restricting Lucan to visitation every other weekend. This total loss of control over his family, coupled with immense financial strain from his debts and the legal obligation to support his estranged family, sent him spiraling. He entered into a state of furious obsession, and slowly but surely he became a dangerous stalker. He began to spy on his wife and record their telephone conversations, fixated solely on regaining custody. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this disturbingly obsessive behavior manifested itself into a very dark plot. Lucan had convinced himself that his wife was the primary source of all his troubles. Friends admitted they had conversations with Lucan in which he explicitly expressed a desire to eliminate her. For him, removing Veronica from the chessboard was a horrific solution that he believed would allow him to get his children back and regain control of his house and finances. So he started planning, but like many plans, this one wouldn't work out quite how he imagined it. The carefully premeditated plan unraveled almost the moment it began, derailed by a routine of aristocratic household management. Lucan was waiting in the basement kitchen of 46 Lower Belgrave Street, expecting to find his wife alone, as he understood the family nanny, Sandra Rivet, had her usual night off. However, Rivet was unexpectedly covering for another employee in the household that evening, and was somewhere that other employee wouldn't have been. When Sandra went downstairs to the kitchen around 9 p.m., she encountered the Earl in the darkness, which totally made him change his course. Rivet was bludgeoned to death with a piece of lead piping wrapped in surgical tape. Sandra Rivet, a mother herself, was only 30 years old. When Lady Lucan went downstairs to investigate why the nanny hadn't brought up tea, she was ambushed at the top of the basement stairs. She was viciously attacked, but she managed to struggle free, possibly by pretending that she would turn over everything to him. Wounded and covered in blood, Lady Lucan fled frantically from the house and burst into the nearby Plumber's Arms pub around 10 that night. She was screaming for help, identifying her own husband as the assailant, and declaring that he had slain Sandra. The alarm was raised immediately. Lucan, recognizing that his catastrophic failure meant imminent exposure and arrest, began his brief flight. He first telephoned his mother, requesting that she collect the children from the house. He then drove a borrowed Ford Corsair to the home of his friends, Susan and Ian Maxwell Scott, in Uckfield, East Sussex, arriving around 1:15 that morning. During his time at the house, he composed several notes, which revealed his conflicted state of mind. He wrote 2 letters to his brother-in-law, William Shand, attempting to set up a flimsy cover story that he had surprised an intruder attacking his wife and fled in panic. Crucially, he wrote a separate note to his friend Michael Stoop, alluding to a, quote, traumatic night of unbelievable circumstances. He asked Stoop to tell his children that Lucan had known him and cared only for them. The despairing finality of this letter suggested a man accepting his fate, overriding the attempt at a formal cover-up contained in the other letters. Unusually, the Scotts waited a highly suspicious 2 days before they contacted the authorities. Lucan's car was discovered abandoned in New Haven, 16 miles from Uckfield, 2 days after the attack. Witnesses stated the car had been parked there sometime between 4 and 8 on the morning after. The time gap between his 1:15 a.m. departure from Uckfield and the car's placement has been subject to intensive speculation. The interior of the car was found stained with type AB blood, potentially consistent with a mixture of blood from both Lady Lucan and Sandra Rivet. Most damningly, investigators found the final, incontrovertible piece of evidence in the trunk. There was a piece of lead piping, identical to the weapon used in the attack, alongside a full bottle of vodka. The overwhelming forensic and testimonial evidence led to an immediate warrant for the arrest of this now disgraced member of the House of Lords. Unusually, the chief detective on the case immediately publicly expressed doubt that Lord Lucan drove the vehicle to New Haven. Instead, he suggested that an accomplice may have placed the vehicle there, for reasons which I'll get to in a moment. Despite the vanishing, legal proceedings continued. In 1975, the inquest jury, convening in Lucan's absence, formally found him guilty for his killing of Sandra. This was an event of profound gravity, marking the first time a member of the House of Lords had been convicted of such a severe crime since 1760. And as a quick aside, since I can't help myself, in that case a member of the House of Lords killed his butler in cold blood. His peers in the House of Lords, who worked with him and knew him and his family, sentenced him to death in an effort to quell the uproar and preserve aristocratic power. Lucan's disappearance immediately splintered into 2 dominant opposing theories. He ended himself, or there was a high society escape. Notably, there's also a bizarre fringe theory involving a framing adding further complexity, which I'll discuss briefly as well, just for completeness' sake. The strongest evidence that he voluntarily ended his own life rests on the logic of the situation and the physical trail. Lucan was exposed, financially destroyed, and facing public condemnation. Self-destruction offered a definitive escape from justice. Further, Lucan must have been aware that any trial would threaten the ongoing privilege of the ancient aristocracy. After all, this was a clear case of a powerful and influential lord who slew an innocent common woman in cold blood. The car was abandoned in New Haven, a port town, and the final letter to Stoop possessed the unmistakable tone of a farewell. His friends publicly went on record saying they believed he had taken a motorboat into the English Channel and smashed it up on the rocks, drowning in the process. Some investigators believe this as well, though no evidence was ever found to prove such a theory. There was no body, there was no smashed-up boat, there was nothing whatsoever, only the vast void of the English Channel. The possibility of escape, however, has captivated the public imagination for decades, largely fueled by Lucan's powerful circle of friends. Lucan was a privileged member of the Claremont Set, a group of wealthy and influential figures who were suspected of facilitating his flight. Police investigations quickly ran into a frustrating wall of silence, suggesting powerful figures were actively hindering the hunt. The Claremont Set included prominent figures such as casino owner John Aspinall and businessman Sir James Goldsmith, both of whom were strongly suspected of helping Lucan evade justice. The most interesting claim for Lucan's survival emerged years later, though it must be clear that this claim is an allegation at present. A woman who had worked for Aspinall claimed in 2012 that she was instructed to book flights for Lucan's two eldest children to Africa. These flights, specifically to Kenya and Gabon, occurred between 1979 and 1981. Her instructions were to facilitate arrangements for, quote, John Bingham, also known as Lord Lucan, to see his children. However, there's a weird twist here. These were arranged as safari trips by Aspinall as a kind gesture to the children of his departed friend. She never claimed that the children themselves had actually been there to see their dad. Rather, they were there to be watched. She claimed the purpose was for Lucan to secretly observe his children during safaris without their knowledge. Lord Lucan did have a history of stalking and making secret observations. So if this is true, I guess old habits die hard. This account, if true, suggests Aspinall and Goldsmith maintained prolonged, regular contact with the fugitive for at least 7 years after the attack. But as you may have noticed, I've been saying if this is true a lot. And the fact is that there's been absolutely no evidence produced to support these allegations. This belief in Lucan's exile has fueled continuous international sightings in locations ranging from Portugal to Australia to various parts of Africa. In 2020, Sandra Rivett's son, Neil Berriman, championed the assertion that Lucan was living as an elderly Buddhist monk in a commune near Brisbane, Australia. This monk was subject to some pretty intense speculation for 2 years, and for reasons that will soon become obvious, I'm not going to show his picture here. In 2022, the man agreed to cooperate with British investigators who used DNA testing to rule him out. A final, highly controversial counter-narrative suggests that Lady Lucan herself was the killer and framed her husband. Proponents of this theory point to the fact that a small amount of Lady Lucan's blood, as well as rivets, was present at the scene. Lady Lucan claimed that this was because her psychotic husband, who was lurking in the basement, tried to bludgeon her as well, a narrative that most people accept as valid. Furthermore, a medical doctor testifying at the inquest conceded that while highly unlikely, it was possible that Lady Lucan's head injuries could have been self-inflicted. This theory holds that Lord Lucan, the guy who was stalking and harassing his wife and family, took the fall for a crime committed by Lady Lucan. Personally, I don't think this theory has the air of reality at all, and I suspect it was just whipped up to sell a book or move tabloids from newsstands. As time has gone on, I think it's clear that it's more and more likely that Lord Lucan died on November 8, 1974. The British courts eventually acknowledged this as a reality, granting the family probate over his estate in 1999. He was declared officially dead in 2016, clearing the way for his son to become the 8th Earl of Lucan. On a spring night in 1087, a band of Italian sailors slipped into a church in Myra, in modern-day Turkey, and stole the bones of a beloved saint, This audacious heist marked the start of an extraordinary journey for the relics of St. Nicholas, the 4th century bishop whose generosity inspired the legend of Santa Claus. According to tradition, St. Nicholas died on December 6, 343, and was buried in the church at Myra, where his tomb became a popular pilgrimage site. Early accounts claimed that a sweet-smelling oil or water, known as the manna of St. Nicholas, collected in his tomb and was prized by pilgrims for its healing powers. For centuries, the saint's remains rested peacefully in Myra, but by the 11th century the region was under threat from the Seljuk Turks. In 1081, the Turks took over the region, with the Greek Orthodox populace of Myra being fully under their control. It's important to note that this occurred after the Great Schism, and relations between Western Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox Church were at an all-time low. Rulers in Christian Europe coveted these ancient holy relics for themselves, knowing that possessing a famous saint's remains could bring prestige and divine favor to their city. In 1087, a group of merchants from Bari in Italy, quote-unquote, liberated the saint's bones before rival seekers could get them. The story goes that the Bari sailors arrived in Myra, posing as pilgrims, then suddenly seized the church by force. They threatened the monks, smashed open Nicholas's stone coffin, and retrieved his skeleton from a pool of liquid, the saint's miraculous manna. Wrapping the bones in cloth, the men fled to their ship with the enraged townsfolk in pursuit. After a 2-week voyage, the crew landed triumphantly in Bari in May 1087. The heist was hailed as a great victory, and the city had gained a powerful patron saint. A grand basilica was quickly built to enshrine the relics, and in 1089 Pope Urban II himself placed Nicholas's bones in its crypt. Crowds rejoiced at the arrival of the relics, and Bari soon became a major pilgrimage destination, drawing believers from both Western Europe and the Eastern Orthodox world. To this day, the city holds an annual festival every May to commemorate the arrival of the saintly remains in Bari. The Italian raiders hadn't managed to take every bone in the smash-and-grab style corpse heist. Some smaller, delicate bones, likely fractures of St. Nicholas's skull and ribs, stayed behind in Myra, possibly broken and overlooked in the chaos. In 1100, during the First Crusade, the Venetians, who had already spirited away St. Mark's relics from Alexandria in 828, mounted their own raid on Myra. They similarly intimidated the monks and seized the remaining bones that the previous raiders had missed, which had been hidden in a wooden chest. These relics were carried off to Venice, arriving on December 6, 1100, St. Nicholas's feast day, and installed in the church of San Niccolò al Lido. Thereafter, most of St. Nicholas's body was acknowledged to lie in Bari, while some smaller portions resided in Venice. Interestingly, from there, the remains of St. Nicholas began to proliferate, with a small trade growing in his remains. In fact, by one count, almost 50 churches around the world have claimed to hold some part of the venerable saint's body. His purported relics turned up across multiple continents in places ranging from Italy, France, and Germany to the United States and Canada to parts of the Near East. This proliferation of fragments is not surprising. Medieval Christians eagerly shared and traded saints' bones. Unscrupulous dealers sometimes sold fake Nicholas relics to meet the high demand from such a popular saint. A highly sought-after saint could generate a large inflow of wealthy pilgrims who would necessarily make large donations for the upkeep of the monastery where the relics were stored. Interestingly, some have questioned whether the remains in Bari are truly those of St. Nicholas. One tale claims that a group of unruly Anglo-Norman crusaders roughed up the clergymen guarding his remains in Bari. According to the lore, these thugs then took the goods back to their holdings in Ireland, where they were subsequently buried and lost. If true, I suppose it would be hard to be too indignant about that subsequent raid, given how the saintly remains were acquired to begin with. But that said, there's very significant reasons to believe that this story is much more fiction than fact. Another story of more recent origin comes from Turkish archaeologists who claim to have potentially found the true remains of St. Nicholas in 2017. Under this theory, the Greek Orthodox monks who were guarding the body hid the real remains after the Seljuk Turks invaded in 1081. When the robbers from Bari came 6 years later, they took these false remains, and the monks decided to keep the truth a secret. However, this tale has one potential serious flaw. The Byzantine Empire ended up beating back the Seljuks and retook Myra in the early 12th century. If a fake body had been stored, it's likely that the real Saint Nick would have been brought back out once order had been restored to Myra. In the modern era, science has helped separate fact from legend. In 1953, during renovations at the Basilica in Bari, Nicholas's tomb was opened for the first time in centuries. The bones were fragile after ages in the crypt, and many reduced to fragments. Researchers noted that most of the larger bones remained, but many smaller and thinner bones were missing, or only present as tiny shards. This pattern matched historical accounts that some parts of the skeleton were accidentally left behind in 1087. The 1950s examination confirmed that all the Bari relics came from a single individual, consistent with there being one St. Nicholas. That individual was an elderly man, likely in his 70s or even his early 80s, a fairly advanced age for the 4th century, though not as rare as pop culture would suggest. Telltale marks on the skull showed a healed broken nose, and bone wear indicated chronic arthritis in the spine. These details align with St. Nicholas's story, as he was said to be an aging bishop who had suffered physical beatings during the Roman persecution of Christians. Interestingly, in 2017, scientific testing provided further validation that these are the bones of the saint. Oxford University researchers radiocarbon dated a bone fragment long reputed to be from St. Nicholas, and found it indeed dates to the 4th century, exactly the saint's era. Likewise, studies have shown that the hundreds of bone fragments held in Venice correspond to the pieces absent from Bari. However, at present, genetic testing hasn't yet been conducted to conclusively confirm whether the remains in Venice and those in Bari are from the same body. It's also thought that some of the missing remains were indeed distributed throughout Europe and the rest of the world. That is to say, not all the fragments out there are fakes, and some may have been gifts legitimately distributed to other religious institutions. Given our technology today, if it can be proven that the Bari remains and the Venice remains are from the same individual, it's possible to verify the true relics of old Saint Nick around the world. The saga of St. Nicholas's bones stretches over 17 centuries, from antiquity to the present, with legend and fact intertwining. From Myra to Bari to far-flung corners of the world, his relics have kept the saint's memory alive and continue to intrigue both the faithful and the curious. The Basilica in Bari still draws throngs of pilgrims from around the world, uniquely hosting both Catholic and Orthodox rites in Nicholas's honor. In a sense, Santa Claus is everywhere, not just as a holiday spirit, but in the physical traces of St. Nicholas's skeleton scattered across the globe. Also, when I wrote that, I thought it sounded poetic, but as I'm recording this, I realize it just sounds macabre. But yeah, if you're hearing this, then that means I left it in. Over 2,000 years ago, ancient sky watchers might have witnessed something astonishing. A new light rising in the sky and seemingly pointing the way to a newborn king. According to the Gospel of Matthew, this star of Bethlehem guided a group of wise men to the birthplace of Jesus. What makes the story so intriguing is that the star behaved unlike any ordinary celestial body. It rose in the east and later stopped over a specific location. No known star or planet does that, which is why the nature of the Star of Bethlehem has remained a tantalizing mystery. Though only a few verses of the Bible mention it, those lines have fueled 2 millennia of speculation about what the wise men really saw. People throughout history have proposed many theories, and modern science continues to explore what this enigmatic light could have been. A leading theory is that the star was actually a planetary conjunction, an alignment of planets that ancient astrologers interpreted as a portent. One long-standing idea is that a spectacular conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in 7 BC was the Star of Bethlehem. In that year, Jupiter and Saturn met not once, but 3 times, in May, September, and December, a rare triple conjunction that occurs only about once in 900 years. Such an event would have been eye-catching for learned sky watchers, and while the wise men are popularly portrayed as being 3 kings, this is a later invention. First off, it's never mentioned that there are 3 wise men, and this tradition appears to derive from the 3 gifts given. Second, in actuality, they were scholars, likely originating from Babylonia, but potentially also Persia as well. As such, they would have been both very familiar with celestial bodies, and would have also possessed at least a passing familiarity with the customs of the people of Judea. Jupiter was associated with kingship, and Saturn with old royal lineage. Seeing these 2 unite in the heavens could signal the birth of an extraordinary king. Some scholars note that this conjunction took place in the constellation Pisces, a sign that certain ancient traditions linked to Judea, making the omen even more specific. Further, these wise men would have likely known that Herod the Great was a client king of the Romans and was, in essence, a local lapdog. As such, they likely wouldn't have looked for someone from this servile lineage, given the power of the omen they had witnessed, if this theory is accurate. The planetary alignment hypothesis helps explain why the star was noted by the wise men, and not by King Herod's advisors, until the travelers showed up. A close pairing of planets can be striking if you know when and where to look, but it's not a blazing beacon that everyone would notice. In fact, a conjunction is modest in brightness, which might be why no one in Jerusalem paid special attention to the sky until it was pointed out. The wise men, being experts in astrology, saw a profound meaning in the Jupiter-Saturn union, while it passed unnoticed by others. This could also be explained by Judea's status as a backwater during this period, and anyone from the region with any real intellectual ambitions wasn't serving King Herod. They were much more likely to be abroad, likely in Alexandria, which was the capital of learning in the Hellenized world at the time. Another popular explanation is that the Star of Bethlehem was a comet, a bright celestial entity with a prominent tail appearing around the time of Jesus' birth. Comets were often seen as omens in antiquity, usually foretelling doom and lowering the stability of kingdoms, and they certainly grabbed attention. And yeah, I can't read about a historical comet without dropping a stability reference. Notably, the Great Halley's Comet passed in 12 BC, but that was almost certainly too early to fit Matthew's timeline, despite scholars periodically attempting to work it into the narrative. Chinese astronomers recorded something unusual in 5 BC, a broom star, likely a comet or nova, that was visible for 70 days. They also noted a possible nova or supernova in 4 BC, around the same period. An object lingering in the sky for months, with no apparent motion, sounds uncannily like Matthew's star standing over a location. Modern analysts find this intriguing. A recent study by a NASA astronomer scoured the ancient Chinese report and calculated that it could have been a comet on a special trajectory. If a comet came toward Earth on just the right path, it could appear almost stationary in the sky for a time. It would appear rising in the general direction of Bethlehem as the Magi journeyed, then seemingly stopping overhead as they arrived. This scenario would mean the star went before the travelers and then stood still due to the geometrical alignment of a near-Earth comet. Such a close pass of a comet, perhaps coming within a few 100,000 miles of Earth, would be extraordinarily rare, but not impossible. Historically, comets were usually viewed as omens of disaster, and the mere sight of one could destabilize a country. Yet in Matthew's story, the heavenly sign heralded good news, suggesting the Magi saw special meaning in this cosmic event. But not everyone is convinced by the comet idea. The Chinese chronicle, though real, is brief, and we have no record of that object from other cultural contexts. If we had multiple reports from multiple different regions, it would be possible to triangulate the reports to better explain what the celestial object likely was. Some scholars argue the Chinese observers might have been describing a nova rather than a comet, since they noted the object's long duration and possibly a broom-like tail. A nova would also create a new bright light in the sky. However, a nova stays fixed among the stars and would not appear to lead people on a journey. A comet, by moving against the starry background, fits the guiding narrative better. The comet hypothesis remains attractive because it directly addresses the star's movement and stopping, but it relies on a very specific and uncommon cosmic event. There's also the possibility that the Star of Bethlehem was not a natural phenomenon at all, but something beyond ordinary astronomy. Many throughout history have believed it was a miraculous event, a divine light placed in the sky to announce Jesus' birth. Early Christian writers like John Chrysostom emphasized that the star acted in a way no normal star could, which to them signified its supernatural origin. In this view, trying to find a scientific explanation might be fruitless, because the star was a one-time miracle. Some early writers even thought it could have been an angelic being or some other form of divine entity guiding the travelers rather than an actual star. They cited the fact that whatever was seen didn't behave like a star at all. On the other hand, some modern scholars suggest the story was meant as symbolic theology rather than an astronomical report. They point out that celestial occurrences in ancient narratives often signaled the importance of a ruler's birth. Matthew's star could have been a literary device in the gospel narrative to show that even the heavens bore witness to the coming of a great king. In other words, the evangelist may not have intended readers to think of a particular star at all, but to understand the message behind the tale. If this understanding is correct, Matthew was essentially using it as a shorthand for the dominion and authority of Jesus. After all, the only people in that time whose births would be signaled with celestial events were people such as Roman emperors. The Star of Bethlehem continues to fascinate astronomers and historians, and in my view, it sits at a very particular crossroads of science, history, and faith. Ancient records do hint at unusual celestial events around the time Jesus was born, yet no single explanation has emerged as the definitive answer yet. The leading theories each have their merits and their problems, and perhaps the enduring mystery of this holy star is part of its allure. Most classic nativity paintings show the birth of Jesus in a humble stable, but pinning down when this event happened requires some historical detective work. In a somewhat bizarre twist, Jesus was born several years before Christ. It sounds like a paradox, but it's a fascinating historical reality. For centuries, most people assumed Jesus of Nazareth was born exactly at the dividing line between BC and AD on our calendar. The truth, however, is that neither the precise day nor the exact year of Jesus' birth is known with certainty. In fact, A closer look at the historical clues shows Jesus likely entered the world a few years earlier than our traditional calendars suggest. The conventional timeline places Jesus' birth at year 1 AD, which is Latin for Anno Domini, meaning in the year of our Lord. This dating system was established in the 6th century by a monk named Dionysius Exiguus, who devised a new Christian calendar era. Dionysius was attempting to replace earlier calendars, like the Roman system that counted from the legendary founding of Rome, with one based on Jesus' coming. He calculated that the year he prepared his Easter calculations was 525 years after the incarnation of Jesus, implying Jesus was born in what he designated year 1. Exactly how Dionysius made his calculation remains unclear, but later analysis suggests he likely made some mistakes. Dionysius's Anno Domini system took a couple of centuries to catch on, and it was popularized by the Venerable Bede in the 8th century, defining the Western calendar ever since. For a long time, however, the exact year of Jesus' birth wasn't a major point of concern in Christian worship. Early believers were far more interested in the date of Jesus' death and resurrection, and devoted substantial time to calculating when this took place on the lunar calendar. In fact, the celebration of Christmas on December 25th only became established a few centuries after Jesus' time. Early Christians seemed to accept that the birth of Jesus was largely inconsequential in terms of when it occurred, and it was treated almost as a piece of trivia in comparison to Easter. The New Testament provides a few key clues about the timing of Jesus' birth. Both the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke associate Jesus' birth with the reign of Herod the Great. Matthew states that Jesus was born in the days of Herod as king of Judea. History tells us that King Herod likely died in 4 BC, a date supported by multiple sources. However, there's much more complexity to this date, which I'll come back to in a moment. Matthew's account also relates that Herod, upon learning of Jesus' birth, ordered the massacre of all boys in Bethlehem aged 2 and under. This detail implies that Jesus could have been as much as 1 or 2 years old at the time of Herod's decree, suggesting a birth at least a year or two before Herod's death. If Herod died in 4 BC, that pushes Jesus' birth to around 6 BC, give or take. Luke's Gospel complicates matters by placing Jesus' birth around the time of a census taken under Quirinius, the Roman governor of Syria and Judea. That census is historically known to have occurred around roughly a decade after Herod's death, so Luke's timing appears at odds with Matthew's. Many attempts to reconcile this discrepancy have been made, though none of these theories are widely accepted. However, the most popular way to synthesize these accounts is a reading of the text to refer to a census that was taken before Quirinius, rather than under him. In any case, Herod's reign remains the more solid historical anchor for dating Jesus' birth, and many scholars believe that the account in Luke is inaccurate. Despite these confusing details, the mention of Herod's rule provides a reasonable time frame for Jesus' birth. Modern historical research, drawing on both biblical and extra-biblical evidence, generally supports the idea that Jesus was born a few years prior to 1 AD. The broad consensus places the event in the range of 6 to 4 BC, based on the known historical markers. This time frame neatly accommodates Matthew's account, with Herod still alive and plotting, and bypasses Luke's chronological problem. However, some scholars argue that Herod may have actually died in 1 BC, and the reason for this is simple. It's undisputed that Herod's 2 sons took over from him, and it's believed by some historians that they may have backdated their reign to 4 BC. Under this theory, Herod's sons may have factually been co-rulers since 4 BC, or they may have simply pretended they were to bolster the legitimacy of their rule. Taking all the evidence together, the widely accepted conclusion is that Jesus was quite literally born a few years before Christ, at least in terms of our calendar. In practical terms, his birth likely occurred in the range of 6 to 4 BC, based on the known historical markers, though this is by no means a sure thing. None of the Gospel accounts provides an exact year, and the ancient records are too scant to ever be fully certain. Ultimately, our modern calendar's year 1 was a best estimate that missed the mark by a few years at most. Pretty impressive.